Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ricky Houston. I'd like to welcome you to first in a series of webinars. We talk about uh, human trafficking, demand reduction, and how do we end human trafficking. And before I introduce our panel, I just want to say thank you. I'm your moderator for today. I serve on the leadership team here for the North Carolina Demand Reduction Task Force. I'm also the Chief Program Officer for Call to Men. So before I introduce our presenters, I want to invite you. I see some of you have already started to share your name, your organization, and your city in the chat as we continue to build this community of an organization as we work together to end human trafficking. So our presenters for today is we're so lucky to have Pam Strickland and Scott Salley, who both serve on the leadership team for of the Demand Reduction Task Force. Pam is the founder of NC Stop Human Trafficking, and Scott is a retired, matter of fact, he retired as a colonel after 30 years of service in law enforcement. He's also an active member of the Catholic Charities of Charlotte Human Trafficking Committee. So happy to have them today. So before we really get into our program for today, I want to give you the vision of the North Carolina Demand Reduction Task Force. Our vision is to develop a state where there is no demand for exploited persons. Our mission is to create and execute a comprehensive plan to reduce demand for services and exploited persons. Our goal of our task force is to launch effective demand reduction programs to address both labor and sex trafficking based on available evidence and best practices. And so last year we hosted a webinar series about sex trafficking and the role that demand plays in exploiting people for sex. This year, our focus is on labor trafficking and the role that demand plays in exploiting people for labor. So we thought it'd be helpful to introduce the topics of labor trafficking, but not only labor trafficking, but also supply chains, for those who may not be familiar with those concepts. So now I'm gonna turn it over to Scott Salley, who's gonna talk to us about labor trafficking. Scott?
All right, thank you so much, Ricky. And again, I'm very honored to present a small piece of labor trafficking today. And I think we'll begin with the blueprint. What is a definition of labor trafficking? The definition reads, and this comes from the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, but it's the recruitment, the harboring, transportation, provision, obtaining, advertising, maintaining, patronizing, or soliciting of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of subjection to involuntary servitude, debt bondage, or slavery. If I may, the three key words which are in bold: force, fraud, or coercion. And we're going to explain those three terms at this time. But first, we need to define the difference between human trafficking and human smuggling. On the news, on different reports, they use, or the different people use these terms interchangeably. They are two distinct titles of criminal activity. So if you will, follow with me, is that first, force, fraud, coercion used to manipulate a victim. They don't know what's going to happen. They can't predict the future. And if you go to the other column, individuals consent to being smuggled. In other words, they know that they are going to be crossing a state line or country or something illegal. Next is crime committed against a person in human trafficking. And with human smuggling, it's crimes against the country they're being smuggled into. Trafficked person does not have to be moved or transported to be considered a victim of trafficking. For some reason, there's a lot of confusion about moving people from country to country, state to state. A victim of human trafficking does not have to be moved. They could be in your community, they could be in your state, or in your region of a state. Human smuggling requires being transported across international borders. Human trafficking is based on exploitation. Human smuggling is transportation based, moving a person or persons from one point to the other. Okay. With that, we've collected the different types of labor trafficking into really 3 silos. And the 3 types of labor trafficking silos, I'll begin with bonded labor, debt bondage. Debt bondage is key to a lot of the criminal activity associated with labor trafficking. It seems to be a little confusing when you want to look at debt bondage, but basically it is really the leverage that a trafficker uses against a victim. So debt bondage or bonded labor is an abuse analogous to slavery in which individuals are pledged to work either for a money lender or a landlord to repay a debt or loan. It applies to children who work either for a money lender or for a landowner as bonded laborers to pay off the debts of family members. The second silo, forced labor, is all work or service which is exacted from any person under the menace of any penalty for its non-performance and for which the worker does not offer work or service voluntarily. And lastly, the last silo, child labor. The term child labor is often defined as work that deprives children of their childhood, their potential, and their dignity, and that is harmful to physical and mental development. Okay. Force. We mentioned there's the 3 types of force, fraud, and coercion. Let's talk about force. You have physical abuse. This has an array of different abuses that can be considered physical. Physical abuse and or the threats of physical abuse are out there that, for example, where I came from, another state, the protectors of the individuals being housed had, and most of them were men with baseball bats. Now, during the interrogation, we talked to, or the interview process, the victim said, we never saw anyone being hit or struck by a baseball bat, but we know they were there, we saw them. So again, physical abuse, the threat. The next is sexual abuse. Sexual abuse is just, first of all, we think of rape, but it involves other things. But it's basically to be punitive for the victim. It also makes the person or the victim lose their dignity. Confinement, looking at different places that victims of labor trafficking cannot leave at will. They can have locked doors, they can have barbed wire over their rooms, anything. Probably the one thing that I remember was at night they took the victim's boots or shoes or footwear. And the philosophy was to the traffickers, if they don't have footwear, they can't run away. And then last, I'd like to mention kidnapping. Kidnapping in the United States is very rare. Even what movies and different stories are out there about people just being abducted off the street. Not in the United States, it's really a rarity. It can happen, but it's a rarity. Fraud. Here we have selling the dream, prosperity dream, enticing a victim to work using a form of persuasion that would make the victim believe they will become financially better off. probably everyone, the majority of people who try to enter the United States or are here already, this is what motivates them to work for someone, to work for a trafficker, to get involved. And that prosperity dream is the commitment they have. Coercion. Different types of coercion: seizure of documentation, taking the visas, taking the passports, any kind of identification. Psychological threats, threats of harm to the victim or the victim's loved ones. This is very important when someone is leaving their country, let's say it's from Central or South America, and a lot of times the trappers know the families or their friends in the villages or towns that they came from, and there would be threats of harming or even worse to their family members. Debt bondage, again, that is when a person has been told or led to believe that they owe a lot of money to the trafficker for a lot of different reasons. Manipulation, again, it's just not only telling lies, but manipulating them so that they believe that they are not only victims, but they're part of the scheme. And providing or withholding drugs, love, affection, children, and food. Okay, how were they trafficked? We're not going to spend a lot of time on the matrix here, but would like to illustrate that if you look at economic abuse at 67%, goes up to 69%, that is probably the leading reason why they're trafficked. Again, the next one, if you scroll down, again, I'm jumping around and I apologize, but look at threats. You'll hear the term threats, whether or not they're mental threats or physical threats, they are threats. And threats drive the conversation or the control power of the traffickers. And then if you look at excessive working hours, again, that is a commonality find with labor trafficking. And then isolation. Well, why would isolation be important? That's usually isolation from their friends, from their family. They can't get feedback. There's no communication. So those are probably the key things that we look for of why they're trafficked. Types of labor trafficking in the U.S. Here we see a smorgasbord of different types of trafficking in the United States as occurs today, may even occur in your community. You look at everything from recreational facilities, healthcare, forestry, and logging. But if we look more at North Carolina, probably the type of industry is usually associated with agriculture or food processing from agriculture. And then we look at the janitorial or the au pair or using restaurant and food service and domestic work. Who are the labor trafficking victims? Again, we have a matrix to show the comparison, and we look at females for labor only. I repeat, labor only is 28%, and then in 2021 it goes to 22%, had a slight decrease. Gender minorities and unknown went from 34 to 30%. But what the trend is today with males, if you look at from 39% in 2020 to 2021, is 48%, a significant increase. Immigration status of likely victims. This is for labor only. Who are the labor trafficking victims? You look at domestic, very low percentage, 2% goes up to 3%. Foreign nationals, 71% to 73%. And then the unknown is 27 to 25%. But I think the key, and I would like to make this a point, is the foreign nationals, especially in today's time, what's occurring is that high percentage of 73%, and it may be a little bit higher than that. Who are the traffickers? Again, we have a breakdown, but I'd like to steer you toward employer. Employer trafficker, look at 57%. That's more than majority. We also look at family member or caregiver. Yes, familial, very similar to sexual exploitation. Family members can be directly involved. Friends, acquaintances, co-workers at 10%. Labor recruiters and contractors at 10%. And let me just add that a lot of people from other countries are wanting to get into the labor force in the United States, seek recruiters to help them out because it is a very long and detailed process. And then lastly is the smuggler at 11%. How are they trafficked? This is 2021. We look at false promises, fraud at 14%. And then we drop down to job offer, advertisement, 72%. So when you have advertisement that's misleading, you don't really need to take people and abduct them off the street. The advertisement, they come to you and they are vulnerable. And then lastly, it's smuggling related, that 9%. Vulnerabilities of labor trafficking: need a job, want a better life, not only a better life for them, but for their family and loved ones. Want to send money home, very, very common. To work here and send whatever they make, the majority of their money they earned goes back home. Immigrant status, hopefully become a citizen one day. They come a lot of times from poverty. I mean, very, very poor. Homelessness, they'll not have a home, of course. Lack of education does not mean that they're stupid by any means. They just haven't had the opportunity to go to school and improve their education. You can just imagine that if you went to a different country, different language, trying to understand all the new laws, how difficult that would be. Lack of status, the cultural barrier of many victims, not only cultural, but the language barrier. Going to a different area that doesn't speak the same language, again, adds a multitude of different problems. And then lastly, not understanding their rights. Even though they may be in our country, they may be in our country illegally, or trying to find a new life, they have rights in the United States. A lot of times they do not understand that. Thank you. Labor trafficking in North Carolina. We're going to start sizing down. We've gone from the global to the United States. Now look specifically at North Carolina. Cases identified in 2021. There are 223 cases were identified in 2021. That was increased. 340 victims were involved in these cases. Cases can involve multiple victims. Total North Carolina cases for labor trafficking. Adults, there's 149 adults. Minors, 51. Genders, females, 180. Males, 25. Foreign nationals, 34. United States citizen, 15. Types of trafficking in North Carolina. Again, the sexual exploitation, 165. labor 34, a combination of sex and labor 6. Types of labor trafficking in North Carolina, venues for labor trafficking, domestic work, we had 9, agriculture farms 6, other 19. Top industries, again, is for the state of North Carolina, as I mentioned before, agriculture, and now we're starting to see an uptick with food processing, agriculture. It's kind of expanding, and then domestic work. This includes janitorial, au pairs, and so forth. We'll look at the case. Labor trafficking. This is the Johnston and Sampson County. The Farm Worker Unit filed lawsuit in federal court in the Eastern District of North Carolina on behalf of 8 H-2A farm workers. The H-2A is the visa that we use for agriculture. The H-2B is for non-agriculture, but this is for the, we're focused on the H-2A, and there was 8 individuals. And the key to this case was that they had to pay kickbacks to the farmers and the people involved in their chain. So that was the kickbacks, and it's not an oddity to see people who are struggling to make it in the United States have kickbacks or pay for the opportunity to work. Labor trafficking, this is another case on labor trafficking. This is Farm Workers Unit secures $75,000 settlement in labor trafficking case. Again, you can, the term threats, if you look to the left, you'll see subjected to threats and coercive manipulation to keep working. They confiscated their passports. It's the United States lawfully under the 2A guest work H-2A guest worker program. Again, the H-2A usually lasts almost just a little short of 1 year, where they're legally can work for one employer, and they have to file for that opportunity. This is a labor trafficking in my county, in Mecklenburg County. This is an interesting case. What we're talking about, this is not agriculture, but it was dealing with labor, and it was a nail salon. And family owned, there's a lot of commonalities to this. The trafficker was a family member. The infliction of mental and physical abuse, 2 types, mental and physical abuse. Actually, the owner of the spa, the one that was convicted of this crime, her physical abuse to her worker, she did everything from putting acetone on her hair to using different types of spa equipment to inflict pain on her. She also falsely claimed that the victim owed her a debt of $180,000, which again, where did that come from? The excessive working hours, work 10 hours a day for 6 to 7 days a week. Falsely alleged victim's poor work performance. That was the reason why she can control her worker. She treated the victim in a humiliating and demeaning fashion. And she used a coercive scheme that caused the victim to fear Luong's control over her. Also, another key piece to this is the defamation piece, that they knew the family, and she was spreading rumors or lies about the victim. And that was, it came up several times during this case, the defamation piece. Okay.
Thank you, Scott. Hopefully everyone has got a better understanding about human trafficking, not only in the U.S., but here, even in North Carolina. Thank you how you really just talked about who the traffickers are and who the victims are. Also, if you have questions of Scott, please use the Q&A feature. Put those questions there. We have time at the end to hear from Scott some more and answer some of those questions for you. But as right now, as we continue to talk about human trafficking, I'm going to ask Pam to come on and talk about supply chains and how they are related to labor trafficking. Pam?
Thank you, Ricky, and thank you, Scott, for really just simplifying what labor trafficking is and just giving us a really good understanding of what it looks like in the U.S. and here in North Carolina. So we thought as we began this webinar series that it would be good to just introduce people to the topic of labor trafficking, but also we realized that it was important that folks understand what a supply chain is and why that's important. And I think a lot of people had never even really heard that phrase or thought about that phrase until the pandemic hit. And all we heard then were, supply chains were disrupted, and that's why we didn't have toilet paper and various other things that were in short supply at the grocery store. So we're going to talk, hopefully give you a little bit better understanding now of what a supply chain actually is and how it's related to labor trafficking. So just a simple definition of supply chain is a network between a company and its suppliers to produce and distribute a specific product to the final buyer. It includes different activities, people, entities, information, and resources. So that's not too hard to understand. It is getting a product from, for instance, if we're talking about a garment, from the cotton field to the point where that cotton becomes fabric, to a sewing factory where that product is turned into a piece of apparel, to a retailer where it gets sold to the end user. So that's what we're talking about with the supply chain. So what does supply chain transparency mean? Supply chain transparency requires companies to know what is happening upstream in the supply chain and to communicate this knowledge both internally and externally. And so just want to make this super clear that it's not only important that the people within the company know what's happening upstream, but that they communicate it to the employees in the company and to their external consumers, their customers, us. So we know that a manufacturer or retailer knows where every piece in the product came from and under what circumstances it was made. They have to know because the company wants to ensure quality and prevent recalls. And also because consumers, the manufacturers and retailers' customers, us, are now beginning to care about the people who make their products. So why is this transparency in the supply chain so important? Well, we can look for a moment at some things that happened when there was a lack of transparency. And we can think back to the Rana Plaza factory collapse back in Bangladesh, when over 1,000 people died in that factory when it collapsed. We can think about the reports we've seen of people on ships that are harvesting seafood and they don't have a choice. They're not able to leave that job. They're coerced to stay there. Some of you might remember hearing about workers jumping out of windows at Foxconn because of the stress and the poor working conditions in that factory. And some of us are aware that in Uzbekistan, the government there actually forces both children and adults to harvest the cotton when that season, when it's time to be harvested. So all of these horrible situations were a result of the retailer not being aware of the ethics or lack of ethics of their suppliers, and not having standards that they were holding their suppliers to. Now, companies are under pressure from governments, from consumers, and NGOs to divulge more information about their supply chains. And the reputational cost of failing to meet these demands can be pretty high. For example, today, food companies are facing more demand for supply chain related information about the ingredients, about whether or not they meet certain certifications, like being GMO free, for instance, or rainforest um, certification, animal welfare, and child labor. So, thankfully, we're beginning to learn more about this, and consumers are beginning to demand more information. In fact, there was a study done by the Harvard Business Review, um, and they found that consumers are willing to pay 2 to 10% more for products from companies that provide greater supply chain transparency. The consumers valued information about the treatment of workers in a product supply chain and the seller's efforts to improve working conditions. Across industries, this growing segment of discerning consumers seeks information on product ingredients and materials, where the products came from, and most important to the anti-trafficking advocates among us, the conditions in which they were produced. So again, why is supply chain transparency important? Well, a lack of transparency can stop businesses cold. For example, shipments that are missing the origin documents are being held up and turned away at ports, causing costly disruptions that ripple through supply chains. So, if there is a country that from which we can't accept an import, um, if any part if at any point along its travels, the cargo touched that country, then it can be turned back. So an example of that would be U.S. Customs and Border Protection turning away shipments that originate or are related to North Korea, because recent federal regulation stipulates that all North Korean labor should be considered forced labor. So even if the product wasn't necessarily made in North Korea, but it traveled through North Korea on its way here, it's going to be turned away at the US border. Back in 2017, the president signed into law the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, which imposes sanctions on Iran, Russia, and North Korea. So I've talked for several minutes about bad things that happen when supply chains are not transparent, or when bad things that can happen when retailers aren't paying attention to who their suppliers are. So now I want to share about a company that does it right. So many of you may be familiar with Patagonia, and they really pride themselves on being pro-environment and pro-worker. And so I want to show you, this is from their website, an example of a transparent supply chain. So they actually have a map that shows you where all of their mills and factories are. The factories are green and the mills are red. And you can click on any one of them. And then you've got view details here. So this is in Sri Lanka. You've got the name of the factory, where it's located, while we work with this supplier, we engage in a range of due diligence activities to promote and sustain fair labor practices, safe working conditions, and environmental responsibility in the finished goods factories, farms, and mills. So they have 983 employees at this factory, and they're making sportswear. And if you, as a consumer, wanted to know even more, then you could look it up through the name and the location of it. But this is an example of them showing you, exactly where their product comes from, which is, kind of a gold standard. And if you'll bear with me, I will get back to our, there we go. So another company, I wanted to show you an example of a standard, basically. Most companies have a code of conduct in place that includes requirements about their suppliers' practices, ranging from the labor practices they have in place to respect for the environment. Companies generally ask for this information from their direct suppliers. But as transparency is becoming more important, companies are increasingly requiring suppliers deeper in their supply chain to comply with codes of conduct and are vetting that information. So here's an example of that to make that a little bit more clear. So this is Ahold Delhaize. This is a huge conglomerate that owns Food Lion and a whole lot of other grocery stores. And we are going to hear from this company in our third session. So I hope you'll stick with us for that. But I wanted to show you just a very small part, obviously, of their code of conduct entitled No Bonded Labor. And they say, suppliers shall not engage in any form of forced, bonded, or trafficked labor. Okay, that's very common. Our supplier will not engage in trafficking, basically. This next sentence is where it gets really key. Suppliers will risk allegations of complicity if they benefit from the use of such forms of labor by their business partners. So not only you, supplier, have to prove to me that you are not exploiting labor, but if I find out that any of your suppliers are using forced labor, then you're going to be held accountable for it. So that's a new thing, and that's key. And in order to rid our supply chains of forced labor, that's what we're going to have. That's the standard to which we're going to have to hold corporations accountable. That, don't tell me that just your direct supplier, didn't use forced labor, but all along your supply chain. And that's why it's important for it to be transparent. So I talked, quite a bit now about what companies behaving badly have, what that's resulted in and what some good companies are doing. But what can we do as consumers? Many of you hopefully have heard this term fair trade, and just a super simple definition of it is here on the screen. A movement whose goal is to help producers in developing countries to get a fair price for their products so as to reduce poverty, provide for the ethical treatment of workers and farmers, and promote environmentally sustainable practices. So, as the North Carolina Demand Reduction Task Force, we want to reduce demand for products that are made by exploited people. And so it makes sense, of course, that we want to increase demand for products that are made by people that are paid a fair living wage. Now, one way that we can do that is by researching companies that we buy from, as in looking at Patagonia's website or looking at any other retailer that you purchase from. Look at their website and see. But if we want something a little less labor intensive, what we can do is look for the fair trade certification, because that kind of guarantees us about the conditions under which the product were made. products were made. So you can see here there are 10 fair trade principles, and you'll be really glad to know I am not going to read all of them to you. But there are a couple that I really do want to stress. And you see here number 4, fair payment. And under that, equal pay for equal work by women and men. Now, we know that globally, for centuries, that has not been the case. And that has led to women having higher rates of poverty than men. And so in order to be fair trade certified, a company has to pay men and women equally for the same job. The other piece to fair payment is a local living wage. And that looks different, we know, in different countries, but it needs to be a wage that they can sustain their family on. Number 5, obviously, I think we can all agree that we support the principle of no child labor and no forced labor. And finally, number 7, good working conditions. And what's meant by that in this context basically is that it's safe and that it's hazard free. They're not working excessive hours out in the sun. They get breaks, that it's a safe place to work. So you might be saying, okay, well, I'm willing to try that. How do I find these fair trade products? And so that's why I'm sharing these logos with you. When you are in your local grocery store, you can look for these different logos and be confident that the products that you're buying are, in fact, made by people who were paid a fair living wage. Now, some of you might be thinking, oh, I don't think my grocery store has anything like that. That sounds kind of newfangled on the edge. However, let me tell y'all, I live in Farmville, population 4,800, and my local grocery store has fair trade. So I'm willing to bet that yours does too. And it may be that you just haven't looked for it yet. So I'm going to tell you the products that you can look for it that are most commonly found in grocery stores that are fair trade certified. And those are coffee, tea, chocolate, and sugar. Now, sometimes you'll just get lucky and find other products. I have found carbonated sodas that had fair trade certification for some of their products, cereals, olive oil, and I will tell you that my personal favorite fair trade product is Ben & Jerry's ice cream. So I invite you to start looking for these logos in your grocery store. Now, some of y'all might be thinking to yourselves, okay, this fair trade sounds interesting, but how did we get here from talking about supply chains? We need to kind of connect the dots here a little bit. So what I'm going to do is show you a traditional supply chain, and then show you what a fair trade supply chain looks like, and I think you will see the difference. So this is a conventional coffee supply chain. And you can see at the top that you could be dealing with a large plantation or a small farmer, and that either way, it goes through a lot of other hands. A mill, various trade agents, exporters, brokers, the roaster, of course, distributors, all these different steps. And at each one of these steps, cost is getting added, and you're getting further and further away from the person who actually harvested the coffee beans, right? There's more and more people in between the person who drinks the coffee and the person who harvested it. And when we look at a fair trade supply chain, you see how that is so much less confusing, right? Many fewer hands touching it, much less requirement for there to be, value added cost all throughout, because there's so many fewer layers. And so there is a closer relationship between the drinker of the coffee and the harvester of the coffee bean. And so what happens in this kind of a supply chain is that the small farmer is getting more money for his or her coffee beans, because you don't have to have as much markup at all those different levels as you do when you're looking here. So um, again, I just encourage you to look for the fair trade logos as you're shopping. And, one thing this is designed to do is just to help us be more mindful of where the products that we consume were created and under what circumstances. And as we become more mindful of that, it is our hope that you might become more demanding from the people and businesses that you purchase from, and hold them accountable for the circumstances under which those products are made. So today we introduced the idea of transparent supply chains and why that's important in reducing labor trafficking. We looked at examples of the tragedies that can happen when retailers aren't informed about their own supply chains, and examples of healthy supply chains that are transparent. And finally, we provided a way for you as a consumer to reduce labor trafficking in your own supply chain by purchasing fair trade certified products. So I think Ricky is going to have some questions for both myself and Scott now. So I am going to stop sharing, and or we'll go there, but I'll stop sharing for a moment so he can do that.
Thank you, Pam. That was so informative, to give us really a great lesson about supply chains. And we do have several questions here in the chat. And Scott, the first one is for you. In your experience or data, have you seen both sex and labor trafficking together, and how often?
There is, really depends on what part of the country, but we informally call that relationship cantina nights, or cantina, where we have people who are forced into labor trafficking to reward them if they do everything they're supposed to do by their masters. And a lot of times it could be they have a restaurant where they would bring the workers in, especially during the harvest or the planting season, and they reward them with a cantina night or cantina night, and they will have let's see, I'm trying to clean this up, people that are in sexual exploitation situations. They perform things like lap dances and so forth for the traffic victims, if that makes sense. So there is a hybridization of labor with sexual exploitation, but it's not that common. I just happen to know about from my previous career, we would see that, and there's some other ways, but the cantina night was probably the most popular.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. And a part two of that question was that how often are we seeing here in North Carolina underage labor trafficking? And if so, where are we seeing it at?
The underage, actually, we're working, there's a case just in the state of Virginia, right across the border, where Department of Labor is investigating as we speak. They were using child labor to come in at night and clean the tools and cutting equipment used in processing. I'm not sure if it's poultry or swine, but it was some kind of animal. And the only reason it came to the surface was one of the young children was cut and had to go to the emergency room, and that developed a case. And again, the federal government has moved in to investigate that. But does it happen? Yes. Do I have a case specifically in North Carolina at this moment? No.
Okay. Thanks, Scott. Pam, I'm going to come to you as we talk about, supply chains. There's a great question. It said, want to know, would buying local help as well as buying fair trade? They say, like farmers market, et cetera. So, however, if we hear rumors that they don't treat their workers fair as well, don't treat their workers well, who do we tell? Great question.
That is a terrific question. So first of all, I do always think that purchasing local is better, certainly. Just at my local grocery store, I remember being so frustrated during the strawberry season here in North Carolina, and they were selling strawberries from California. I just thought, what? Or, there are, of course, products that are grown here in the US and they're importing them from other countries. So, yes, I think for a number of reasons, buying local is better from a potential labor trafficking standpoint, as well as from an environmental standpoint. As far as who to contact, contacting your local police department is certainly one option. And you can certainly also contact the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And that is the source. All of those great numbers that Scott shared with us, they all came from the National Human Trafficking Hotline. So I can put that into the chat for y'all. And if you see something involving either labor or sex trafficking that you think that you have a suspicion about, you can call the hotline. And I do want to just mention, notice my words. I said something you have a suspicion about. You do not need to go and ask questions. You don't need to go and try to get someone out of a bad situation. And you don't need to prove that it's human trafficking. All you need to do, all of your responsibility is to make a call if you're suspicious. And to keep everybody safe, that's all you need to do is just make the call.
Thank you, Pam. Scott, I want to come back to you. Someone want to draw from your experience, those 30 years of experience in law enforcement. Said, can you tell us about the working conditions of people who were trafficked that you've seen through your time as a law enforcement officer?
Oh gosh, I promise I would not share any war stories, but and I probably the worst case of labor and human trafficking, especially involving children, was a young boy and his sister, 14, 13, 13, 12, that age group. And they were brought into the United States to live with uncle and aunt. And they would not feed them. They did not go to school. They had tethers or leashes around their neck so that they had to stay at the feet of their aunt and uncle. And because of starvation, they ate paper. And when we went in to rescue them, the boy had to have surgery because the paper became like paper mache. It was like a cast on a broken bone. And they had to remove all that. And the young girl was, again, malnutrition and everything else, but she did not have that surgery. But I used to work with some very tough guys, men and women, and all of us had a tear in the eye from watching that.
Yeah. Thank you, Scott, for sharing. I know it's, reliving that, just a lot of pain hearing about that. Thank you for sharing that. Pam, I want to come back to you as we think about those supply chains. Do any states have laws about supply chain transparency?
Actually, yes. The only one that I'm aware of is California, and it passed the California Supply Chain Transparency Act, and it has some good components to it. The main thing is that it requires, sort of like what I showed you with the Patagonia, it requires for the company to make public where the product's actually manufactured, and all along the way what the supply chain is. I would say a weakness in that particular act is that only companies with $100 million in sales or higher are required to do that. So I think they could lower that number a little bit.
Yeah, thank you. Now you talked about sanctions as well. If a container came into the port, that our country will return that container if it comes from a country with forced labor. I think probably the question is that why is China not one of those countries?
So that's a good question, Ricky, and I'll just have to say it like it is. China is the largest trading partner of the United States, and our government is not willing to stop that inflow of products coming from China.
Thank you, Pam. Scott, one final question for you. Why do you think labor trafficking continues to grow?
I think trafficking, whether or not it's labor trafficking or sexual exploitation, but more specifically labor trafficking, it thrives where vulnerability is high, where people are desperate and their options are limited or non-existent. And the trafficker has huge profits from the agony and what the victims have to do to make money for the traffickers. So very simply, the supply and demand. We need to cut the head off the snake, and that's supply and demand.
Thank you, Scott. One final question for you, Pam. Someone just put in the chat, especially as we talked about California, said, how can we get that in North Carolina or something better, referring to the California law? So who do we need to talk to, whether it's legislation or representative or whatever?
Well, if someone's interested in working on that, please contact me and we will join forces. And yes, we definitely do. We would need to talk with our legislators about that. Ricky, if you don't mind, I wanted to go back to one of the previous questions about child labor trafficking here in North Carolina. Mm-hmm. I'm not aware of a current case that has hit the media, although as Scott pointed out, the issue with children working in very dangerous, especially factory type situations, is becoming, we're getting to a crisis point just across the country, and there have been cases here in North Carolina. So that's something that needs to be addressed. But I did want to share a couple of cases that have happened in North Carolina. One, several years ago, 2 teenage girls were lured from North Dakota to North Carolina to sell magazines. So something that we need to be aware of as consumers is when we see, a van pull up into a neighborhood and a bunch of young people get out and they go out to sell various things, not necessarily just magazines, that could be a red flag. Obviously, if it's our local Boy Scouts, that's one thing. But if it's, out of state plates, and it's, I always say this when I'm doing a training: if it doesn't feel right in your gut, then it's not right. You need to make a call. So in that particular instance, the girls were safely recovered, and as far as we know, they were not sexually exploited. It was just a labor trafficking scenario. And the other case that I'll share took place, that one that I just mentioned took place in Wilmington. The other one took place in Cumberland County, and it was a case of a minister who required his congregants to work in businesses that he owned. and that included some fish markets, and children were required to work there as well, and instead of going to school. And so they, they're cutting up fish, young kids, 6, 7, 8-year-old kids cutting up fish and carrying around these big crates and that kind of stuff, completely inappropriate for their age. And again, they should have been in school. Finally, one of the older kids ran away and got law enforcement involved, and those people were, in fact, convicted of labor trafficking those children, which is a plus. I would like to put in a plug here again, though, for calling when you see something, because how many people from the community had gone into those fish markets and seen those kids working, knowing they should have been in school, and didn't make a call. So, we are all in North Carolina, all adults are mandated reporters if you see a minor being potentially abused and neglected. And again, want to remind you, you don't have to prove it's child abuse. You don't have to prove it's labor trafficking. You just see something that doesn't look right. Your only responsibility is to call that in.
Thank you so much, Pam. Pam, Scott, thank you both so much today for your expertise and sharing this time in the knowledge around human trafficking, labor trafficking, and also supply chains. And so today we talked about labor trafficking and supply chain transparency in broad terms, hoping to give you a general understanding of the meaning of these terms. And so as we talk about today is the first in a series of webinars. So next week, we'll get a little bit more specific. We'll have 3 survivors sharing their perspectives about labor trafficking. Also, the following week, we'll have the ethics director of Hodel Hayes, the company that owns Food Line that Pam talked about a little earlier. They'll talk about their efforts to keep their supply chain from excluding exploited labor, and the owner. Also have the owner of a large North Carolina farming operation discussing how he values the impact his workers have of his business also. Then we'll take a break for Thanksgiving, and then we have our final session where we discuss the elements of a statewide plan that reduces demand for labor trafficking. And so Pam's going to put the link there in the chat. So please register now for those webinars. Will be very, very informative. And want to say thank you again for spending the last hour with us, and look forward to you being a part of our next webinars. Scott, Pam, thank you so much for your expertise that you shared with us today.
All right.
Thank you so much for our attendees for being with us today as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Ricky.